The California sun beat down on the tarmac at Marine Corps Base Pendleton, turning the asphalt into shimmering waves of heat. Eleanor Voss stepped out of the passenger van, her worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned long ago that haste and precision were incompatible. At 67, she carried herself with quiet dignity, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, her face mapped with the kind of lines that came from squinting into distant horizons. The van driver, a young corporal named Torres, rushed around to help with her bag. She waved him off with a gentle smile. "I've got it. Thank you," she said. Her voice carried the texture of decades, warm but firm. Torres persisted anyway, hovering uncertainly. "Ma'am, I can take that to the admin building for you. Are you here visiting someone?" Eleanor adjusted the bag on her shoulder, feeling the familiar weight of her personal rangefinder and notebooks inside. "Something like that," she replied, her eyes already scanning the base layout with the automatic assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime evaluating terrain and angles. Across the parking area, a group of Marines in digital camouflage utilities clustered near a black SUV, their voices carrying on the dry air. They were young, probably mid-20s, with the particular swagger that came from recent deployment rotations and intensive training cycles. Their conversation punctuated with laughter, the easy camaraderie of warriors between missions. One of them, a staff sergeant with sharp features and precisely maintained bearing, noticed Eleanor walking toward the administration building. He nudged his companion, a stocky corporal with a thick neck and heavy brow. "Hey, Mendez, check it out. Someone's grandma got lost looking for the commissary." The group's attention shifted. Another Marine, a lean lance corporal with restless energy, grinned broadly. "Maybe she's here for the senior center tour. Does Pendleton do those?" Their laughter rippled through the group, not cruel, but casually dismissive, the thoughtless humor of young men who had never considered that the elderly woman crossing their field of view might be anything other than what she appeared. Eleanor heard them, her hearing still sharp despite her years, but she did not alter her pace or expression. She had heard worse, much worse, in places far more hostile than a California military base. Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan, the one who had initiated the commentary, leaned against the SUV with arms crossed. His uniform was immaculate, his boots mirror bright, his bearing that of someone who took professional pride in every detail. He had just returned from a successful rotation in the Pacific Theater, his reputation as a competitive shooter growing with each qualification cycle. Seriously, though, Torres better help her find wherever she's supposed to be. Last thing we need is some confused civilian wandering into restricted areas. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've seen veterans in your community who deserve more respect. Mendez shifted his weight, his expression slightly uncomfortable. "Come on, Brennan. She's probably someone's family member. Cut her some slack." Brennan shrugged, his smile easy and confident. "I'm just saying, man. This is a working base. We got the inter-service competition starting tomorrow. A lot of moving parts, a lot of security considerations. Civilians need proper escort." Eleanor reached the administration building steps and paused, turning slightly to survey the base she had not seen in nearly 2 decades. The layout had changed, new buildings erected where old ones had stood, but the essential character remained. She could still identify the armory, the rifle ranges in the distance, the motor pool where generations of Marines had maintained their vehicles. Her eyes, pale blue and sharp behind rimless glasses, took in everything with a methodical observation that had once saved her life more times than she could count. Inside the building, cool air and fluorescent light replaced the harsh sun. A young sergeant sat behind the reception desk, his attention on his computer screen. Eleanor approached quietly, setting her bag down carefully. "Excuse me, Sergeant. I'm Eleanor Voss. I believe Colonel Hartwick is expecting me." The sergeant looked up, surprise flickering across his face as he processed the elderly civilian woman before him. He recovered quickly, professional training overriding his initial reaction. "Yes, ma'am. One moment, please." He picked up his phone, pressed a button, spoke briefly into the receiver. "Ma'am, the colonel will be right down. You can have a seat if you'd like." Eleanor settled into one of the plastic chairs lining the wall, her posture straight despite the uncomfortable seating. Through the window, she could see Brennan's group still clustered by their vehicle, now joined by two more Marines. They appear to be discussing weapons configurations, their hands moving in the universal language of shooters, describing holds and positions. She recognized the passion in their gestures, the competitive energy that drove marksmen to pursue ever greater precision. Colonel Hartwick descended the stairs with measured steps, his uniform crisp despite the late afternoon heat. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent considerable time in desert climates. When he saw Eleanor, his expression transformed into genuine warmth. "Gunny Voss," he said, extending his hand. "It's an honor to have you here." Eleanor stood, accepting his handshake with a firm grip. "Colonel," she replied, "thank you for the invitation, though I'm not sure how much help I'll actually be." Hartwick smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "Don't sell yourself short. These young shooters could learn a lot from your experience. Come on, let's get you situated and then I'll brief you on the competition format." They walked through corridors lined with photographs of Marine history, past offices where staff worked at computers and filed paperwork. Eleanor noticed how the Marines they passed gave her curious glances, clearly wondering who this elderly civilian woman was and why the base commander himself was escorting her. Hartwick led her to a small office that had been set aside for her use, furnished simply with a desk, filing cabinet, and window overlooking the rifle ranges. "You'll be observing the competition as a technical advisor," Hartwick explained, settling into a chair across from the desk. "Your official designation is civilian consultant, which gives you access to all the ranges and briefings. The shooters don't know who you are yet. I thought it might be educational to let them make their own assessments first." Eleanor set her bag down, understanding immediately what Hartwick was suggesting. "You want them to underestimate me," she said quietly. Hartwick's smile held a hint of mischief. "I want them to learn that assumptions can be dangerous. We've got 15 competitors, all top qualifiers from their units. Most of them are under 30. They're skilled, confident, and frankly a little cocky. This competition runs over 4 days, progressive difficulty, culminating in some extreme long-range work that'll push everyone to their limits." "What kind of distances are we talking about?" Eleanor asked, her interest sharpening. "We start conventional at 800 meters, work up to 1,500 by day 2, then push to 2,000 and beyond if we have shooters still in contention. The brass wants to evaluate our advanced capabilities, see who can handle the really challenging scenarios." Hartwick paused, studying Eleanor's face. "I've read your file, Gunny. The classified parts, I mean. I know what you're capable of." Eleanor's expression remained neutral. "That was a long time ago, Colonel. Different equipment, different circumstances. Skills like yours don't fade," Hartwick countered. "They're bone deep. Besides, I'm not asking you to compete. Just observe, offer technical insights, maybe help us identify training gaps." Eleanor nodded slowly. "What does it start?" "Tomorrow morning, 0700. There's a formal briefing for all participants in the conference room. You'll attend as my guest." Hartwick stood, preparing to leave. "One more thing, Gunny. Most of these kids don't know the history. They don't know the names, the legends, the people who built the programs they benefit from now. It might be good for them to discover that those people are still around." After Hartwick departed, Eleanor unpacked her bag methodically. She removed her rangefinder, a well-maintained Leica that she had purchased with her own money 30 years earlier. Her notebooks came next, filled with decades of data on wind calls, atmospheric conditions, and ballistic calculations written in her precise handwriting. Finally, she withdrew a small leather case containing her shooting glasses, custom brown lenses that corrected for the minor astigmatism she had developed in her left eye. She stood at the window, watching Marines move across the base grounds. In the distance, she could see the rifle ranges where tomorrow's competition would begin. The berms, the target stands, the firing lines where men and women would test their skills against distance and wind and their own limitations. She had spent so many years in places like this, had trained so many shooters who went on to distinguished careers, had made shots that remained classified even now. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who bore little resemblance to the warrior she had once been. The silver hair, the lined face, the reading glasses perched on her nose. No one looking at her would imagine the classified file that existed somewhere in a secure database, would know about the deployments she could never discuss, the medal she had been awarded in private ceremonies, the record that might never be broken because it might never be acknowledged. That evening, Eleanor ate dinner in the base cafeteria, selecting a quiet table near the windows. The room buzzed with conversation, mostly young Marines discussing training schedules and upcoming assignments. She noticed Brennan's group at a large table across the room, their voices occasionally rising above the ambient noise. They were clearly excited about tomorrow's competition, their gestures animated as they discussed strategy and equipment choices. A female Marine, a gunnery sergeant with auburn hair pulled back in a tight bun, approached Eleanor's table. "Mind if I sit, ma'am? The cafeteria is pretty full tonight." "Please do," Eleanor replied, moving her tray slightly to make room. The woman settled across from her, extending her hand. "Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Reeves. I work in logistics here on base." "Eleanor Voss," Eleanor replied simply, not offering additional details. Reeves studied her with friendly curiosity. "Are you here for the competition? Family member competing?" Eleanor smiled gently. "Something like that. I'm here in an advisory capacity." Before Reeves could ask more questions, Brennan's voice cut across the cafeteria. "Hey, Reeves, you coming to watch tomorrow? Should be a hell of a show. Got shooters from 3 different divisions competing." Reeves turned toward him. "Wouldn't miss it, Brennan. Someone needs to keep you humble when you start bragging." The table erupted in laughter, good-natured ribbing flowing freely. Brennan grinned confidently. "I'll let my shooting do the talking. Been training for this all quarter." Eleanor listened quietly, finishing her meal as the young Marines continued their banter. None of them noticed her attention. None of them registered her presence as anything significant. The conference room filled quickly the next morning, competitors filing in with their notebooks and coffee cups, their conversations energetic and confident. Eleanor entered quietly behind Colonel Hartwick, taking a seat along the side wall, while the shooters occupied the rows of chairs facing the projection screen. She noticed how none of them acknowledged her presence, their attention focused on their peers and the equipment list being discussed in hushed tones. Brennan sat in the front row, flanked by Mendez and 2 other Marines from his unit. He had clearly prepared extensively, his notebook already open to pages of handwritten calculations and wind charts. The Lance Corporal who had joked about Eleanor the previous day, whose name tag read Holloway, sat directly behind him, leaning forward to examine Brennan's notes. Colonel Hartwick moved to the front of the room, his bearing commanding immediate silence. "Good morning, Marines. Welcome to the Pendleton Precision Challenge. Over the next 4 days, you'll face progressively difficult shooting scenarios designed to test not just your marksmanship, but your ability to read conditions, adapt to equipment variables, and perform under pressure." He clicked a remote, bringing up the first slide showing the competition structure. Day 1 focuses on fundamentals at 800 meters. Clean shots, proper form, consistent groupings. Day 2 extends to 1,500 meters with variable wind conditions. Day 3 introduces moving and partially obscured targets at ranges up to 2,000 meters. Day 4 is reserved for our most qualified shooters only, extreme distance work that will challenge everything you think you know about long-range precision. Eleanor watched the competitors absorb this information, noting their reactions. Most appeared confident, even eager. A few looked thoughtful, already running mental calculations. Brennan's expression held pure competitive hunger, the look of someone who expected to dominate. Hartwick continued, "You'll be evaluated on accuracy, consistency, adaptation speed, and professional conduct. We have several observers and technical advisors present throughout the competition. Their insights will factor into our final assessments." He gestured toward Eleanor without elaborating on her specific credentials. Please treat all staff with appropriate respect and professionalism. Brennan glanced briefly at Eleanor, his expression neutral but dismissive. He clearly assumed she was administrative support or perhaps someone's family member allowed to observe. His attention returned immediately to Hartwick as the colonel began detailing equipment specifications and range protocols. After the briefing concluded, the competitors moved toward the armory to check out their assigned rifles. Eleanor followed at a distance, observing how they handled the weapons, noting their choices in optics and their discussions of ammunition selections. She remained silent, simply watching as they made decisions based on their training and experience. The first range session began under cloudless skies, temperature already climbing toward uncomfortable levels. 15 shooting stations were arranged along the firing line, each with spotting scopes and wind flags positioned at intervals downrange. The targets at 800 meters appeared as small dark circles against the berms, challenging but manageable for trained marksmen. Eleanor positioned herself behind the firing line with several other observers, including 2 master sergeants who served as official scorers and a captain for the training division. She pulled out her rangefinder and notebook, beginning her own documentation of conditions and performance. Brennan took his position at Station 7, his movements practiced and confident. He settled behind his rifle, a standard M40A6 with premium optics, his body alignment textbook perfect. Eleanor watched him work through his pre-shot routine, noting the efficiency of his movements and the steadiness of his breathing pattern. The range safety officer called the line hot. 15 rifles spoke nearly simultaneously, the reports echoing across the desert landscape. Downrange, spotters called hits and misses through radio headsets. Brennan's first shot landed center mass, a clean hit that drew an approving nod from the master sergeant scoring his lane. As the morning progressed, Eleanor moved slowly along the firing line, observing each competitor with the same thorough attention. She noticed a corporal at Station 3 who was fighting his rifle instead of flowing with it, his shoulder tension creating inconsistent recoil management. At Station 11, a female sergeant demonstrated excellent wind reading but was compensating for a scope mounting issue rather than addressing the root problem. During a break between strings of fire, Eleanor approached the corporal at Station 3. His name tag identified him as Valdez, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the relatively mild morning temperature. She spoke quietly, her voice gentle but clear. "Excuse me, Corporal. I noticed your shoulder position might be creating some difficulty." Valdez looked at her with barely concealed surprise, clearly wondering who this elderly woman was and why she was offering shooting advice. His expression held polite tolerance rather than interest. "Ma'am, I appreciate the input, but I've been shooting this platform for 3 years. I know my setup." Eleanor nodded, accepting his dismissal without argument. "Of course. Just an observation." She moved on, making a note in her notebook about the tension issue and the young Marine's unwillingness to accept feedback from an unexpected source. At Station 7, Brennan was discussing his performance with Mendez, clearly satisfied with his consistent groupings. Eleanor paused nearby, studying the wind flags and atmospheric conditions. The wind was beginning to shift, moving from predominantly left to right to a more quartering pattern that would require different compensation calculations. She made several notations in her notebook, her handwriting quick and precise. Brennan noticed her writing and exchanged a glance with Mendez, amusement flickering across his face. He leaned toward his friend, his voice low but audible to Eleanor's sharp hearing. "What's she doing, taking notes for the colonel? Maybe she's writing a report on how impressive we all are." Mendez chuckled uncomfortably. "Come on, man. She's probably just interested in the competition." Brennan shrugged, his attention already returning to his rifle. "Whatever, long as she stays out of the way and doesn't distract anyone during hot firing." Eleanor continued her observations, unfazed by the dismissive comments. She had encountered far worse skepticism in far more consequential situations. Young warriors often needed to learn through experience rather than instruction, needed to face challenges that exceeded their current capabilities before they developed the humility to accept wisdom from unexpected sources. By midday, the competition had separated into clear tiers. Brennan led the scoring, his consistency impressive even by Eleanor's exacting standards. 3 other shooters clustered near his performance level, including Gunnery Sergeant Reeves, who had joined Eleanor for dinner the previous evening. The middle tier showed solid competence, but lacked the refined edge of the leaders. The bottom tier struggled with various technical and mental challenges that would likely eliminate them before day 3. Eleanor approached Colonel Hartwick during the lunch break, finding him reviewing score sheets in the observation tower. She pointed to several names on his list. The corporal at Station 3 has a shoulder tension issue that's affecting his recoil management. The sergeant at 11 needs her scope remounted. There's play in the rings. The private at Station 2 is compensating for a breathing pattern problem rather than correcting it. Hartwick studied her notes with interest. Good catches. Should I have the coaches address these issues? Eleanor considered carefully. That depends on what you want them to learn, Colonel. If this is about developing self-awareness and diagnostic skills, let them figure it out. If it's about maximizing performance, then intervention makes sense. The afternoon brought the promised wind shift, transforming the range conditions from manageable to genuinely challenging. The flags along the course danced erratically, switching directions with the kind of unpredictability that separated competent shooters from exceptional ones. Eleanor watched from the observation tower as the competitors returned to their stations, many of them displaying visible frustration with their morning performances. Brennan remained confident, though Eleanor noticed subtle changes in his approach. He was taking longer between shots now, clearly working harder to read the shifting conditions. His hits remained consistent, but the effort was beginning to show. At Station 12, a young corporal named Chun was struggling badly, his shots drifting wide as he failed to adjust quickly enough for the variable winds. Eleanor descended from the tower and walked slowly along the firing line, her notebook open, her observations detailed. She paused near Chin's position, watching as he sent another round downrange that missed left by nearly 2 feet. The young Marine's jaw clenched in frustration, his breathing becoming irregular as stress mounted. During the next break, Eleanor approached him quietly. The wind's quartering now, moving at about 8 knots with gusts to 12. You're compensating for the steady state, but not accounting for the gusts. Chin looked up at her, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and defensiveness. Ma'am, with respect, I can see the flags. I know there's wind. Eleanor nodded patiently. Of course you can see them, but you're reading the flags closest to your position. The wind at 600 meters is doing something different than the wind at your muzzle. Watch the middle flags, the ones at 400 to 500 meters. That's where your bullet is most vulnerable to deflection at this distance. Chin glanced downrange, clearly considering her words despite his initial resistance. His expression suggested he wanted to dismiss her advice, but was desperate enough to try anything. Who are you exactly, ma'am? Are you with the training cadre? Just an observer, Eleanor replied simply. Someone who spent a lot of time watching wind flags. She moved on before he could ask more questions, leaving him to wrestle with whether to trust the advice from an unexpected source. At Station 7, Brennan was in conversation with one of the range coaches, a master sergeant named Williams, who had been a competitive shooter himself before moving into instruction. Brennan was gesturing toward his scope, explaining his holdover calculations with the confidence of someone certain in his methodology. Eleanor paused nearby, close enough to hear their discussion. Williams was nodding along, affirming Brennan's approach. You're doing fine, Staff Sergeant. Your fundamentals are solid. Just keep doing what you're doing. Eleanor studied the wind flags again, noting the specific pattern developing. She checked her rangefinder, verified the distance, consulted her notebook where she had been tracking wind speed variations over the past hour. The conditions were creating a convergence zone at approximately 500 meters, where the wind was actually accelerating rather than diminishing. Most shooters would undercompensate, failing to account for that acceleration. She cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, Master Sergeant. Staff Sergeant. I don't mean to interrupt, but the wind at 500 meters is doing something interesting right now." Both men turned to look at her. William's expression held polite curiosity, while Brennan's showed thinly veiled annoyance. Eleanor continued, her voice calm and matter-of-fact. "There's a terrain feature creating acceleration in the wind speed right at the midpoint of your bullet's flight path. The flags show it if you watch the sequence from near to far. You might need to add about 0.5 mil to your windage to account for it." Brennan's smile was patronizing, the kind reserved for well-meaning but uninformed civilians. "Ma'am, I appreciate your interest in the competition, but I've been calculating wind calls for 5 years. I know how to read flags." Williams shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain whether to support his shooter or acknowledge the observation from someone Colonel Hartwick had introduced as a technical advisor. He opted for diplomacy. "We'll keep an eye on it, ma'am. Thank you for the input." Eleanor simply nodded and moved on, making a notation in her book about the wind convergence pattern and the timestamp. She had learned long ago that some lessons could only be taught through experience, that young warriors often needed to fail before they could truly learn. When the line went hot again, Eleanor watched Brennan's shot with particular attention. He fired with his usual confidence, his form perfect, his calculations based on his 5 years of experience. The round landed 8 inches left of center, still technically a hit, but noticeably off from his previous consistency. Eleanor saw confusion flash across his face as he worked his bolt, chambering another round. His second shot, using the same holdover, landed in nearly the same spot. Now his confusion turned to frustration. He was doing everything right according to his understanding, but the results were inconsistent with his expectations. Williams moved to his position, bringing a spotting scope to examine the impacts more closely. Meanwhile, at Station 12, Chun had taken Eleanor's advice. She watched him study the middle-distance flags carefully, saw him adjust his point of aim with greater compensation than he had been using. His next shot impacted near center, drawing a surprised exclamation from a spotter. Chen's posture changed immediately, confidence replacing the earlier frustration. His subsequent shots maintained the improved accuracy, each one benefiting from his new attention to the mid-range wind behavior. As the afternoon wore on, the separation between competitors became more pronounced. Brennan remained in the lead, but his margin had narrowed. Reeves was shooting exceptionally well, her adaptability to changing conditions impressive. 2 other Marines, a sergeant named Kowalski and a corporal named Duncan, were also performing strongly. Chun had climbed out of the bottom tier into the middle pack, his improvement visible to everyone watching. During the final break before the last shooting string, Brennan approached Eleanor directly for the first time. His expression was controlled, but she could see the competitive fire behind his eyes. "Ma'am, I noticed you giving advice to some of the other shooters. Colonel Hartwick said you're a technical advisor. What's your background exactly?" Eleanor met his gaze calmly. "I spent some time around rifles and ranges, Staff Sergeant. Picked up a few things over the years." Brennan waited, clearly expecting more detail. When Eleanor offered nothing further, he pressed slightly. "Any particular specialization? Competition shooting? Law enforcement?" "Various applications," Eleanor replied neutrally. "Mostly just a lot of observation and some practical experience in different conditions." His expression suggested he found her vagueness suspicious or perhaps amusing. "Well, I hope the advice you're giving is sound. Last thing we need is civilians confusing the competitors with outdated techniques or incorrect information." Eleanor's smile was slight but genuine. "That's a fair concern, Staff Sergeant. I try to only offer observations when I'm quite certain of the conditions. The wind at mid-range really is accelerating right now. Your fundamentals are excellent, by the way. Very solid shooting. The conditions are just particularly tricky this afternoon." Brennan nodded, accepting what he perceived as a compliment from an enthusiastic but ultimately irrelevant observer. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll keep working my system. It's got me this far." He returned to his station, conferring briefly with Williams before settling back into position. Eleanor watched the final string with quiet attention, her notebook filling with detailed observations about each shooter's adaptation patterns and decision-making processes. Some were learning quickly, adjusting their approaches based on feedback from their impacts. Others remained locked into their established methods, unable or unwilling to recognize when conditions demanded different responses. As the day concluded and scores were tallied, Brennan maintained his lead, but barely. Reeves was only 3 points behind, with Kowalski close on her heels. Chun had made the most dramatic improvement, climbing 6 positions in the rankings. Several shooters have been eliminated based on their cumulative scores, their competition ending after just one day. Day 2 began with morning fog rolling in from the Pacific, reducing visibility and adding moisture content to the air that would affect ballistic calculations. The remaining 10 competitors gathered at the 1,500-meter range, their expressions more serious now. The casual confidence of day 1 tempered by the reality of challenging conditions and genuine competition. Eleanor arrived early, walking the range in the pre-dawn darkness, feeling the temperature and humidity, observing how the fog settled in layers at different elevations. She made extensive notes about the atmospheric density, the way moisture was concentrating at certain altitudes, the likely trajectory behavior through these varying conditions. By the time the shooters assembled, she had compiled a detailed analysis of the environmental factors they would face. Brennan stretched near his gear bag, working through a warm-up routine while discussing strategy with Mendez, who had been eliminated the previous day but remained to support his unit's competitors. The staff sergeant appeared focused and determined, clearly having spent the evening reviewing his performance and planning his approach for the extended distance. Reeves arrived with her coach, a weather gunnery sergeant named Patterson who had been coaching competitive shooters for 15 years. They were engaged in quiet discussion about scope adjustments and ammunition selection for the longer range. Eleanor noticed the careful preparation, the methodical approach that characterized serious shooters who understood that success at 1,500 meters required consideration of factors that barely registered at shorter distances. Colonel Hartwick gathered everyone for a brief safety overview and conditions update. Visibility is limited this morning, but should improve by mid-morning as the fog burns off. That creates its own challenge since your conditions will change significantly during your shooting window. Part of today's evaluation is how well you adapt to evolving environmental factors. Eleanor stood quietly to the side, her presence now familiar enough that the competitors no longer questioned why she was there, though they still seemed uncertain of her actual function. She was simply the older woman with the notebook who occasionally offered observations that some chose to ignore and others found mysteriously helpful. The fog began lifting as the first shooting string commenced, revealing the distant targets in stages like a slowly developing photograph. At 1,500 meters, the targets appeared as tiny dark shapes, requiring precise optic adjustment and careful wind assessment. The increased distance magnified every error, transforming minor miscalculations into significant misses. Brennan fired his first shot after a lengthy preparation period. The round impacted low and right, missing the target entirely. His jaw tightened, visible frustration crossing his features. He adjusted his scope, recalculated, fired again. Another miss, this time high and left. The pattern suggested he was chasing his impacts rather than correctly diagnosing the problem. Eleanor moved closer, watching his third shot preparation. She could see the tension building in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his trigger hand that came from mounting stress rather than poor fundamentals. When his third shot also missed, landing right at target, she spoke quietly from several feet behind his position. The moisture content is affecting your trajectory more than you're accounting for, Staff Sergeant. The fog layer between 500 and 800 meters is creating significant drag. You'll need to come up about 0.7 mils from your standard calculation. Brennan paused, his hand on the bolt. He looked back at her, his expression caught between desperation and skepticism. Ma'am, with respect, I'm already compensating for humidity. I ran the numbers this morning. Eleanor nodded patiently. I'm sure you did, but the fog isn't uniform. It's concentrated in a specific altitude band that your bullet passes through for about 300 meters of flight. That's creating drag conditions that aren't in your standard humidity calculations. Think of it as shooting through 3 different atmospheric zones instead of one consistent environment. Brennan stared at her for a long moment, clearly wrestling with whether to trust advice from someone whose credentials remain mysterious. Finally, necessity overcame pride. He made the adjustment she suggested, adding elevation to his scope. His next shot impacted center mass, a clean hit that drew an audible reaction from Williams, who was spotting for him. The staff sergeant's expression transformed from frustration to surprise to something approaching respect. He turned fully toward Eleanor. "How did you know about the fog layers? That's pretty specific environmental reading." Eleanor smiled gently. "Spent a lot of time watching how bullets behave in different conditions. Fog can be tricky because it's not uniform like rain or consistent humidity. It creates pockets and layers. You have to read where those layers are and how dense they are at different altitudes." Before Brennan could ask more questions, she moved on to observe other shooters. At Station 3, Kowalski was experiencing similar difficulties, his shots consistently impacting low. At Station 8, Rees had already identified the fog layer issue and adjusted accordingly, her shots grouping tightly near center. Duncan was struggling with windage, unable to identify a subtle cross breeze that was only present at the target end of the range. During a break, Eleanor found herself near the equipment tables where several shooters were adjusting their rifles and discussing the challenging conditions. Brennan approached, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine curiosity. "Ma'am, I've been meaning to ask. You said you spent time around rifles. Were you a competitive shooter? The way you read conditions is really precise." Eleanor carefully cleaned her glasses with a microfiber cloth, considering her response. "I did some shooting in my younger years. Different context and competition, but the fundamentals of reading environment and understanding ballistics are pretty universal." Holloway, who was helping Brennan with ammunition sorting, interjected with a grin. "What, like hunting? My grandma used to hunt deer. She was a pretty good shot, too." "Something like that," Eleanor replied mildly, not taking offense at the comparison. "Though the ranges I worked at were usually a bit longer than typical hunting distances." "How much longer?" Brennan asked, his interest clearly piqued. "Depended on the situation," Eleanor said carefully. "Sometimes quite a bit longer. I learned to pay very close attention to environmental factors because in certain contexts, missing wasn't really an option." The way she said it, the subtle gravity in her tone, created a brief silence. Mendez, who had been listening from nearby, studied Eleanor with new attention. His expression suggested he was beginning to suspect there was more to her background than she was revealing. Brennan seemed to sense it too, his demeanor shifting from casual curiosity to something more attentive. Before the conversation could deepen, Colonel Hartwick called everyone back to the line for the next shooting string. The fog had burned off completely now, replaced by clear morning air and rising temperature. The change conditions required completely different calculations, testing the shooter's ability to adapt quickly rather than rely on previous data. Eleanor watched Brennan apply the lessons from the morning, saw him carefully assess the new conditions rather than simply reverting to his standard approaches. His shooting improved markedly, his confidence rebuilding on a foundation of greater environmental awareness. When he completed his string with 4 consecutive center mass hits, he looked back toward where Eleanor stood, offering a slight nod of acknowledgement. At the end of day 2, the field had narrowed to 5 competitors. Reeves led the standings narrowly ahead of Brennan. Kowalski held 3rd position, with Duncan and a young corporal named Barnes rounding out the remaining field. Chun, who had improved so dramatically the previous day, had been eliminated after struggling with the extreme distance calculations. As the competitors packed their equipment, Eleanor overheard Brennan talking with Williams. "I don't know who that woman is, but she knows her stuff. Saved my bacon twice today with condition calls I completely missed." Williams agreed, adding that he'd never seen anyone read fog layers with that kind of precision without specialized meteorological equipment. Eleanor gathered her own materials, making final notes on the day's observations. Tomorrow would bring moving targets and partial concealment, adding complexity beyond pure environmental reading. She found herself curious to see how these young warriors would handle the additional challenges, whether their growing respect for unexpected sources of wisdom would translate into greater openness to instruction. Day 3 introduced complications that separated technical shooters from tactical ones. The targets at 2,000 meters were no longer stationary circles on static berms. Instead, the range officers had positioned silhouettes that moved on mechanical tracks at irregular intervals, appearing and disappearing behind terrain features and artificial barriers that simulated real-world engagement scenarios. The 5 remaining competitors assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, their demeanor noticeably different from the confident swagger of day 1. They understood now that this competition was exposing gaps in their training, revealing limitations they hadn't known they possessed. Brennan stood with his rifle case, talking quietly with Reeves about timing calculations and lead angles for moving targets at extreme distance. Eleanor arrived carrying a thermos of coffee and her ever-present notebook, now filled with 3 days of detailed observations. She had spent the previous evening reviewing her notes, identifying patterns in each shooter's decision-making process, their adaptability curves, their responses to stress and uncertainty. Colonel Hartwick joined her at the observation post, reviewing the day's course of fire. "This will test whether they can integrate everything they've learned," he said quietly. "It's one thing to hit a stationary target when you have time to calculate everything perfectly. It's another to make split-second decisions when your window of opportunity is measured in seconds." Eleanor nodded, watching the shooters prepare their equipment in the growing light. The young Corporal, Barnes, looked particularly nervous, his movements rushed and imprecise. Duncan appeared focused and methodical. Kowalski was going through an elaborate pre-shot ritual that seemed more superstitious than functional. Reeves and Brennan both displayed the calm intensity of experienced competitors who understood the magnitude of the challenge ahead. The first target sequence began at 0700 sharp. A silhouette appeared from behind a berm at 1900 meters, traveled left to right at approximately 3 miles per hour for 8 seconds, then disappeared. The shooters had been briefed on the timing, but actually executing a hit required calculating lead, elevation, windage, and timing the shot release for the precise moment when all factors aligned. Reeves shot first, her preparation swift and confident. The round impacted behind the target, suggesting insufficient lead. She worked her bolts smoothly, adjusted, fired again as the target emerged on its second pass. Another miss, this time ahead of the silhouette. Her third shot connected solidly, center mass, drawing approval from her coach Patterson, who had been calling wind for her. Brennan took his time, studying the target's movement pattern through his scope during the first complete cycle. Eleanor watched him count silently, his lips moving slightly as he calculated timing intervals. On the target's second appearance, he fired deliberately. The impact was low, but on the correct lateral plane. He adjusted elevation and fired again on the third pass. Clean hit, slightly right of center, but well within the kill zone. Duncan struggled with the timing, his shots consistently arriving after the target had disappeared. Kowalski managed 1 hit out of 5 attempts, his elaborate ritual apparently providing little practical benefit. Barnes failed to connect at all, his nervousness manifesting in rushed shots and inadequate preparation time. During the mid-morning break, Eleanor approached Barnes, who sat alone, staring at his rifle with visible frustration. The young corporal looked up as she settled onto the bench beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. "Tough morning," she said simply. Barnes laughed bitterly. "That's putting it kindly, ma'am. I'm getting destroyed out there. Can't time anything right. By the time I've calculated everything, the target's gone." Eleanor nodded sympathetically. "The calculation paralysis problem. You're trying to compute everything consciously instead of trusting your training to handle some of it automatically." She paused, studying his face. "May I ask what you're thinking about during your shot preparation?" Barnes counted on his fingers. "Wind speed, wind direction, distance, bullet drop, travel time, target speed, lead angle, elevation adjustment, breathing, trigger press. It's like 10 things all at once. Eleanor smiled gently. That's the problem right there. You're consciously processing things that should be automatic by now. Think of it like driving a car. When you first learned, you thought about every action consciously. Now you just drive. Your body knows what to do. She gestured toward the range. You've already proven you can calculate distance and wind. Those skills are solid. For moving targets, you need to trust that foundation and focus only on timing and lead. Let your fundamentals run on autopilot. Barnes looked skeptical but desperate enough to listen. So just focus on when to shoot and how much to lead? Exactly, Eleanor confirmed. Watch the target through one complete cycle without your rifle. Just observe. Let your brain process the rhythm unconsciously. Then on the next cycle, mount your rifle and flow with the movement. Don't calculate lead mathematically. Feel it intuitively based on what you just observed. Trust that your fundamentals will handle everything else. The corporal nodded slowly, turning the advice over in his mind. Worth a try, I guess. Not like my current approach is working. When shooting resumed, Eleanor watched Barnes implement the simplified approach. His first attempt was still a miss, but closer than his previous efforts. The second attempt connected, a solid hit that caused him to pause in surprise. His third and fourth attempts also connected, his confidence visibly rebuilding as he stopped overthinking and started flowing with the target rhythm. At Station 1, Brennan was shooting with growing consistency. He had clearly adapted to the timing requirements, his hit rate approaching 70%. Reeves matched his performance, their friendly rivalry pushing both of them to higher levels of precision. Kowalski had abandoned his ritual and was shooting more naturally, with modest improvement in his results. Eleanor noticed Colonel Hartwick conferring with the range safety officer and several other officials near the observation tower. Their body language suggested serious discussion, occasionally glancing toward the shooters and then toward distant range facilities. After several minutes, Hartwick broke away and approached Eleanor directly. "We have a situation developing," he said quietly. "Some visiting brass just arrived unexpectedly. General Morrison and his staff from Camp Pendleton headquarters. They want to observe the competition, and they're asking about demonstrations of our extreme range capabilities." He paused, his expression concerned. "They're talking about shots beyond 2,000 meters. Significantly beyond." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "How far beyond?" 2,700 meters, Hartwick replied. "There's a target stand at that distance that we use for equipment testing and advanced training. Morrison wants to see if any of our current competitors can perform at that level. He's evaluating our readiness for certain operational requirements that apparently demand extreme precision at extreme distances." Eleanor glanced toward the firing line where the 5 competitors were between strings. "That's a significant jump from 2,000. Different ballistic regime entirely, different environmental factors, different everything. Have any of them trained at that distance?" Hartwick shook his head. "Brennan and Reeves have both shot 2,200 in control conditions. The others max out around 2,000. 2,700 is honestly beyond current qualification standards for most units." He looked directly at Eleanor, his expression meaningful. "It's more in line with specialized applications. Very specialized." The implication hung in the air between them. Eleanor understood exactly what kind of specialized applications required reliable precision at 2,700 meters. She also understood that Hartwick was indirectly asking whether she thought any of these young shooters were ready for that challenge. "When do the brass want this demonstration?" she asked. "This afternoon," Hartwick replied. "After the current course of fire concludes. They're setting up observation positions now." He hesitated. "Gunny, I know what I'm asking is irregular, but if none of our competitors can perform at that level, it reflects poorly on our training programs. Morrison is considering budget allocations and program priorities. A failure here could have consequences beyond just this competition." Eleanor looked out across the range, toward the distant hillside where the 2,700-meter target was barely visible even through binoculars. She hadn't fired a rifle in anger in nearly 20 years, hadn't attempted an extreme distance shot in even longer. Her eyes weren't what they once were. Her hands carried the subtle tremor of age. Her body no longer possessed the endurance of her prime years. But some things went deeper than age, deeper than physical capability. Some skills were etched into muscle memory so profoundly that decades couldn't erase them. Some knowledge was earned through experiences that couldn't be taught in any school, through situations where failure meant consequences far graver than damaged pride or lost competitions. "Let's see how the morning session finishes," she said finally. "Maybe one of them will surprise us." The morning session concluded with Reeves and Brennan firmly established as the top performers, their scores nearly identical. Duncan held third position but trailed significantly in points. Kowalski and Barnes had shown improvement but remained clearly behind the leaders. As the competitors secured their weapons and prepared for the lunch break, word spread quickly about the afternoon's unexpected demonstration requirement. Eleanor watched the reactions as Colonel Hartwick briefed the shooters about General Morrison's request. 2,700 meters was a distance that existed more in mythology than practical training for most Marines. It represented the edge of what was theoretically possible with standard equipment, the realm where tiny errors cascaded into massive misses, where atmospheric conditions mattered more than pure marksmanship skill. Brennan's face showed a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He had dreamed of attempting such shots, but had never actually trained at that distance. Reeves appeared thoughtful, running calculations in her head, clearly trying to assess whether her skills could extend that far. Duncan looked overwhelmed, already accepting that this challenge exceeded his current capabilities. "The demonstration is voluntary," Hartwick explained. "No penalty if you choose not to attempt it. But for those who do, it's an opportunity to showcase the highest levels of precision marksmanship. General Morrison and his staff will be observing from the command post. Consider it carefully during lunch." As the group dispersed toward the mess facilities, Eleanor remained at the range, walking slowly toward the distant hillside where the 2,700-meter target had been positioned. The walk took nearly 15 minutes, her pace unhurried, her eyes constantly assessing terrain features, wind indicators, elevation changes. She reached the target location and stood for several minutes, looking back toward the firing line that appeared impossibly distant. The target itself was a standard silhouette, human-sized, mounted on a steel frame. At this distance, it would appear as little more than a dark speck through even the best optics. She studied the surrounding geography, noting how the terrain created wind channels and thermal effects, how the elevation gain between firing line and target would affect trajectory calculations, how the angle of afternoon sun would create mirage effects that could deceive even experienced shooters. On her walk back, she encountered Brennan heading in the same direction, clearly intent on conducting his own reconnaissance of the target location. They met halfway, standing on the gentle slope that formed the range's middle ground. The staff sergeant seemed less certain of himself now, his earlier confidence tempered by the reality of the challenge ahead. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, his tone notably different from their first encounters. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Eleanor replied. "Have you ever seen anyone make a shot at this distance? Successfully, I mean. Not just get lucky, but actually demonstrate consistent capability at 2,700 meters?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I've seen it done, yes. Not often, and not by many people. It requires exceptional skill, perfect conditions, excellent equipment, and frankly, a bit of luck. Everything has to align precisely." Brennan looked toward the distant target, his jaw tight. "I'm thinking about attempting it. Reeves is too. But honestly, I'm not sure either of us has the experience base for this. We'd essentially be guessing at corrections we've never actually validated." "That's honest self-assessment," Eleanor said. "There's no shame in recognizing the limits of your current training. The Marine Corps didn't prepare you for 2,700-meter shots because that's not a standard operational requirement." She paused, studying his face. "Why do you feel compelled to try?" Brennan was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "Because General Morrison is watching." Because this could affect our program funding. Because every shooter dreams of making an impossible shot. He laughed without humor. And maybe because I've been cocky enough this week that I need to be reminded what humility feels like. Eleanor smiled slightly. That last reason might be the best one. There's value in attempting things that exceed your grasp, as long as you go in with realistic expectations. She gestured back toward the firing line. If you do attempt it, trust your fundamentals, but don't be married to your calculations. At this distance, intuition matters as much as mathematics. You have to feel the shot as much as compute it. They walked back together in companionable silence. At the staging area, General Morrison had arrived with his staff, a group of senior officers whose presence created palpable tension among the competitors. Morrison was in his early 60s, lean and weathered, with the bearing of someone who had spent a career in demanding operational environments. His reputation preceded him as both a demanding leader and a strong advocate for advanced training programs. Colonel Hartwick made introductions, and Eleanor found herself being presented to the general as the technical advisor who had been providing environmental assessment support during the competition. Morrison studied her with sharp eyes that missed very little. Technical advisor, he repeated. What's your background, Ms. Voss? Various applications over the years. General, Eleanor replied neutrally. Mostly observation and environmental analysis for precision shooting scenarios. Morrison's expression suggested he suspected there was more to her background, but he didn't press. Well, I'm interested to see what our current crop of shooters can do with this challenge. 2,700 meters is extreme by any standard, but operational requirements are pushing us toward longer engagement distances. We need to know if our training programs are preparing people for that reality. The afternoon session began with Brennan volunteering to shoot first. The gathered brass assembled in the observation tower with spotting scopes and rangefinders, their conversations hushed as the staff sergeant took his position. Eleanor stood slightly apart, her own binoculars raised, watching not just Brennan, but the environmental conditions, the subtle shifts in wind patterns, the building thermals as afternoon heat intensified. Brennan's preparation was meticulous, his calculations extensive. He conferred with Williams about ammunition selection, verified his scope settings multiple times, studied the wind flags until Eleanor thought he might be overthinking the problem. Finally, he settled into position, his breathing steady, his form textbook perfect. The shot echoed across the range. Through her binoculars, Eleanor saw the impact far left and low, missing the target by at least 6 feet. Brennan adjusted, recalculated, fired again. Closer, but still a clear miss, this time right and high. His third attempt landed nearer still, but remained outside the target area. After 5 rounds, he had failed to connect once. He rose from his position, frustration evident in every line of his body. Williams offered quiet encouragement, but the staff sergeant shook his head, clearly disappointed in his performance. He returned to the observation area where the other competitors waited, their expressions sympathetic, but also relieved that they weren't the only ones finding this distance impossible. Reeves attempted next, her approach more intuitive than Brennan's methodical calculations. She fired 3 rounds in quick succession, each one missing but with decreasing margins. Her 4th shot impacted the lower edge of the target stand, technically a miss but tantalizingly close. She adjusted minimally and fired her 5th round. Another near miss, inches from connection. Patterson encouraged her to continue, but she stepped back, shaking her head. That's as close as I can get, she said simply. Duncan declined to attempt, recognizing that if the top 2 shooters couldn't connect, his chances were essentially 0. Kowalski tried and missed badly with all 5 rounds. Barnes attempted 2 shots before voluntarily withdrawing, his earlier confidence completely eroded by the impossible distance. General Morrison's expression was carefully neutral, but Eleanor could read the disappointment beneath his professional demeanor. He conferred quietly with his staff, their body language suggesting concerns about program adequacy and training gaps. Colonel Hartwick stood nearby, his jaw tight, clearly aware that this demonstration was reflecting poorly on his installation's capabilities. Eleanor set down her binoculars and made a decision that she knew would change everything. She approached Colonel Hartwick quietly, speaking so only he could hear. "Colonel, with your permission, I'd like to attempt the shot." Hartwick turned to face Eleanor fully, his expression shifting from surprise to something approaching hope. "Gunny, are you certain? This is a very public moment. If you miss, there's no taking it back." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I understand the stakes, Colonel, but I've walked that range, I've read the conditions, and I believe I can make the shot. If I'm wrong, the embarrassment falls on me, not your program." Hartwick studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He raised his voice to address General Morrison and the assembled observers. "Sir, our technical advisor has volunteered to demonstrate the shot. Ms. Eleanor Voss has extensive background in precision marksmanship and has requested the opportunity to attempt the 2,700-meter engagement." Morrison's eyebrows rose skeptically. His gaze moved to Eleanor, taking in her age, her civilian clothes, her unassuming appearance. The murmurs from his staff were audible, skepticism mixed with amusement at the idea of an elderly woman attempting what trained Marines had just failed to accomplish. One officer, a colonel with silver eagles on his collar, spoke loud enough for several people to hear. "Is this some kind of joke, Hartwick?" Brennan had been standing with the other competitors, processing his own failure. When he heard Eleanor's offer, his head snapped around in surprise. "Ma'am," he said, stepping forward. "With respect, 2,700 meters is extremely difficult. Even with your knowledge of conditions, actually making the shot requires years of specific training at these distances." Eleanor turned to face him, her expression gentle but firm. "I appreciate your concern, Staff Sergeant. You're right that it requires extensive training." She paused, her eyes holding his. "I've had that training." The implication in her words, the quiet confidence in her tone, created a moment of silence. Brennan's expression shifted as pieces began connecting in his mind. The impossibly precise environmental readings, the deep knowledge of ballistic behavior, the way she moved around rifles and ranges with unconscious familiarity. He stepped back, his skepticism transforming into curious uncertainty. Reeves spoke up from near the equipment tables. "Ms. Voss, if you're serious about attempting this, you'll need a rifle. Mine is available if you want to use it." Eleanor shook her head politely. "Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant, but I'd prefer to use my own equipment if that's acceptable." She looked to Hartwick, who nodded permission. "I'll need about 10 minutes to retrieve it from my vehicle and conduct pre-flight checks." She walked to the parking area with steady purpose, her earlier careful elderly woman's pace replaced by something more efficient and direct. From her locked truck bed case, she withdrew a hard rifle container that showed signs of decades of use but meticulous maintenance. Inside lay a custom M40A5 that predated the current A6 model, its stock worn smooth from countless hours of use, its barrel showing the patina of professional care over many years. The rifle was equipped with a Schmidt and Bender scope that Eleanor had purchased 30 years earlier with her own money and maintained ever since. She checked the scope settings, verified the mounting tension, examined the barrel in action with practiced efficiency. From a separate case, she withdrew hand-loaded ammunition, rounds she had developed herself for specific ballistic performance at extreme distances. When she returned to the firing line, carrying the rifle case, the atmosphere had shifted. The competitors watched her approach with new attention, noticing details they had missed before. The way she carried the case, the fluid efficiency of her movements, the complete absence of uncertainty or hesitation. This was not an enthusiastic amateur or a curious civilian. This was someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Eleanor unpacked the rifle on the shooting table, her actions methodical and unhurried. She removed her jacket, revealing a faded Marine Corps t-shirt beneath, its unit insignia too worn to read clearly. She pulled shooting gloves from her bag, fitted them carefully. From a small pouch, she withdrew a worn data book, its pages filled with decades of handwritten notes, ballistic tables, and environmental correction factors. Brennan moved closer, watching her preparation with growing realization. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his tone completely different now. "Who are you exactly?" Eleanor looked up from her rifle, her pale blue eyes meeting his directly. "Someone who spent a lot of years doing work that required very long shots in very difficult conditions. Staff sergeant. Someone who learned that missing wasn't an option when lives depended on precision." The gathered Marines were silent now, the casual dismissiveness of earlier completely gone. Even General Morrison had moved to the front of the observation tower, his binoculars ready, his skepticism tempered by curiosity about what he was about to witness. His staff officers clustered around him, their conversations hushed. Colonel Hartwick approached Eleanor as she conducted final equipment checks. "The brass wants to know your credentials, Gunny." Morrison is asking direct questions. "I've been vague so far, but if you're about to make this very public attempt, your background is going to come out." Eleanor paused in her preparation, considering. "After the shot, Colonel, win or lose, I'll explain everything. But right now, I need to focus on the work." She looked toward the distant target, barely visible as a dark speck against the hillside. "Besides, my credentials won't mean much if I can't back them up with performance." Hartwick nodded and stepped back, giving her space. The range safety officer approached to coordinate the hot firing procedures. Eleanor listened to his briefing with professional attention, asking two specific questions about range boundaries and safety protocols that demonstrated deep familiarity with range operations. She moved to the firing position, settling behind her rifle with the fluid ease of someone who had occupied such positions thousands of times. Her body alignment was perfect without conscious thought, decades of muscle memory guiding every adjustment. She removed her glasses, revealing eyes that despite their age still possessed the clarity and focus of a natural shooter. Through her scope, the target appeared as a small dark shape wavering slightly in the mirage effects of afternoon heat. Eleanor began her breathing routine, deep and steady, lowering her heart rate, centering her focus. Around her, the noise of observers and wind and distant base activity faded into background static. There was only the target, the rifle, the environment, and the decades of experience that lived in her bones. She watched the wind flags for several minutes, not calculating consciously, but allowing her mind to process the patterns at a level deeper than mathematics. The flags told a story of swirling air currents, thermal effects, pressure variations across the 2,700 meters between her muzzle and the target. Her fingers made minute adjustments to her scope, corrections based not on formulas, but on intuitive understanding earned through countless similar shots in her past. Brennan watched from behind her position, his arms crossed, his expression intense. Beside him, Reeves stood equally focused, both of them recognizing they were witnessing something significant. Williams had his spotting scope raised, ready to call the impact. General Morrison leaned forward on the observation tower railing, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine interest in how this would unfold. Eleanor's breathing steadied to the deep rhythm that preceded her shots, the pattern so ingrained it happened without thought. Her finger moved to the trigger, applying the first stage of pressure, feeling the mechanism's familiar resistance. The wind flags showed a momentary lull in the gusting pattern, a brief window where conditions aligned as favorably as they were likely to get. She felt the shot more than decided it, her finger completing the trigger press in the space between heartbeats, the rifle recoiling smoothly into her shoulder with the familiar authority of a precisely loaded round. The report echoed across the range, and in the scope Eleanor watched the trace of her bullet arcing across the impossible distance toward a target that represented not just a technical challenge, but a validation of who she had once been and who, perhaps, she still was. The seconds stretched as the bullet traveled its arc across 2,700 meters of California air. Eleanor remained motionless behind her rifle, her breathing suspended, her eyes still pressed to the scope. Through the magnified optics, she watched the trace, that barely visible shimmer that marked her bullet's path through varying atmospheric densities and wind currents. The impact was invisible at first, too distant for the human eye to process clearly. Then William's voice cut through the silence, his tone carrying shock and something approaching awe. Hit. Center mass. Perfect impact. For a moment, nobody moved. The observers stood frozen, processing what they had just witnessed. Then the observation tower erupted in activity as General Morrison's staff raised their binoculars and spotting scopes, confirming what seemed impossible. An elderly woman in a faded Marine Corps t-shirt had just accomplished what their trained competitive shooters could not. Eleanor worked the bolts smoothly, chambering another round. She settled back into position without pause, her movements economical and precise. If one shot could be luck, two would establish capability. She read the wind flags again, noted the subtle shift in thermal activity, made a fractional adjustment to her point of aim. Her breathing cycle repeated, deep and steady, her finger finding the trigger's familiar resistance. The second shot followed within 30 seconds of the first. Again the report echoed. Again the bullet traced across impossible distance. Again Williams called the impact. Hit. Upper center mass. Consecutive successful engagements at 2,700 meters. Now the silence broke completely. Brennan let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Reeves stood with her mouth slightly open, her competitive mind racing to understand what skill she had just witnessed. The young Marines who had joked about someone's grandmother just 3 days earlier stared in stunned disbelief. General Morrison descended from the observation tower with his staff following, all of them converging on the firing line. Eleanor remained in position, firing 3 more rounds in methodical succession. Each one connected solidly with the target, her grouping tight enough to cover with a dinner plate at a distance where most shooters couldn't even land a round on the target stand. 5 for 5. Perfect performance under observation by senior brass and competing Marines who now understood they had been in the presence of a master without recognizing it. She cleared her rifle with practiced efficiency, rendering it safe before setting it carefully on the shooting table. Only then did she stand, removing her shooting gloves and replacing her glasses with movements that seemed suddenly weary, as though the effort of the shooting had released tension she had been carrying for days. General Morrison reached her first, his expression transformed from skepticism to intense interest. "Ms. Voss, that was extraordinary shooting. I need to know your background. Those weren't lucky shots. That was world-class precision marksmanship." Eleanor met his gaze steadily, her voice calm and clear. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Eleanor Voss, retired. Marine Corps Scout Sniper, multiple deployments across 3 decades of service. Specialized in extreme distance precision engagements in support of special operations. My last active duty was 19 years ago, but some skills don't fade as much as people might think." Morrison's eyes widened in recognition. Voss. Eleanor Voss. The name came back to him from classified briefings and operational reports he had read years earlier. You were part of the program in the 90s. The Advanced Marksmanship Initiative that supported JSOC operations. Your file is still partially classified. Yes, sir, Eleanor confirmed. Much of what I did remains sensitive. But the fundamental skills, the environmental reading, the ballistic understanding, those I can discuss and demonstrate. That's why Colonel Hartwick invited me here as a technical advisor, though I suspect he hoped I might provide more than just observations. Hartwick stepped forward, his expression vindicated. "General, Gunny Voss has been providing environmental analysis and technical guidance throughout this competition. Several of our shooters have benefited from her insights, though most of them didn't understand the depth of experience behind those observations." Brennan approached, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine humility. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. I dismissed your advice multiple times, treated you like an interested civilian rather than someone who clearly knows more about this craft than I've forgotten." Eleanor turned to him, her expression kind. "Staff Sergeant, you had no reason to know who I was. I looked like someone's grandmother wandering around a range. Your skepticism was natural." She smiled slightly. "Though I hope the experience taught you something about assumptions and the value of listening to unexpected sources of wisdom. Reeves joined them, her competitive nature evident even in this moment of stunned realization. Gunny, with respect, you just shot 5 for 5 at 2,700 meters. That's beyond exceptional. That's world record territory. How many years of practice does it take to develop that level of capability? Eleanor considered the question carefully. I fired my first rifle at age 7. Joined the Marines at 18. Spent 33 years in service, with approximately 20 of those years focused primarily on precision marksmanship. She paused, her eyes distant. I've made shots in conditions far worse than today, when failure meant teammates died or missions failed. The pressure you feel in competition is nothing compared to the weight of real operational consequences. The other competitors had gathered close now, their earlier casual attitudes completely transformed. Duncan asked the question several of them were thinking. Why didn't you tell us from the beginning? Why let us dismiss you and ignore your advice? Because sometimes the most valuable lessons come from discovery rather than instruction, Eleanor replied. If I had introduced myself as a master gunnery sergeant with decades of sniper experience, you would have deferred to my authority. You might have listened to my advice, but you wouldn't have truly learned from it. She looked at each of them in turn. Now you'll remember that expertise doesn't always announce itself with rank insignia and obvious credentials. You'll remember to pay attention to what people know rather than just what they appear to be. General Morrison had been conferring quietly with his staff officers, several of whom were making notes and speaking into phones. He turned back to Eleanor with purpose. Gunny Voss, I'm authorizing immediate funding for an advanced marksmanship program based on what I've witnessed here. I want you to develop curriculum, train instructors, and establish protocols for extreme distance precision shooting. What you demonstrated today represents capability gaps in our current training that need to be addressed immediately. Eleanor nodded slowly. I'd be honored to contribute, General. Though I should mention that what I demonstrated today was aided by perfect conditions, familiar equipment, and decades of very specific training. Teaching others to reach this level will require time, resources, and realistic expectations about how long skill development takes. Understood, Morrison replied. But you've proven the ceiling is higher than we've been aiming for. That alone is valuable. He extended his hand. Thank you for your service, Gunny, both past and present. What you did today reminded everyone here that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. As the official conversations continued, Brennan stood slightly apart, watching Eleanor pack her rifle with the same meticulous care she had shown throughout. He approached her quietly, his voice sincere. Gunny, I know I was dismissive and arrogant this week. That's on me. But I want you to know that watching you shoot today was one of the most educational experiences of my career. Not just the technical skill, but the humility, the quiet confidence, the way you let your performance speak rather than your credentials. Eleanor looked up from securing her rifle case, her expression warm. You're a skilled shooter, Staff Sergeant. You have excellent fundamentals and strong competitive instincts. What you need now is time, experience, and the wisdom to recognize that there's always more to learn. She closed the case with a decisive click. Keep training, stay humble, and remember that every person you meet knows something you don't. Even grandmothers. Brennan smiled, accepting the gentle rebuke. Especially grandmothers, he agreed. News of Eleanor's demonstration spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. By evening, Marines who hadn't witnessed the shots firsthand were seeking out those who had, demanding details and confirmation of the impossible story. A 6 to 7-year-old woman, a retired master gunnery sergeant no one had heard of, had outshot their best competitive marksman at a distance most considered theoretical. Eleanor sat in Colonel Hartwick's office, reviewing the proposed training program that General Morrison's staff had drafted in the hours following her demonstration. The document outlined an ambitious curriculum covering extreme distance shooting, environmental analysis, and advanced ballistic calculations. Hartwick sat across from her, coffee growing cold between them as they discussed implementation details. The General wants you as lead instructor, Hartwick said, tapping the document. full civilian contractor position, appropriate compensation, housing on base if you want it. He's serious about building this program properly, and he knows you're the foundation it needs. Eleanor studied the curriculum outline, her experience eye-catching both the strengths and gaps in the proposed structure. This is good foundational work, Colonel, but it's missing several critical elements. The environmental reading component needs to be at least 3 times longer than what's outlined here. You can't teach someone to read conditions in a week. It takes months of observation, pattern recognition, and practical application. Hartwick leaned back in his chair. So help us fix it. You have carte blanche to design this however you think it should be structured. Morrison made that very clear. Build it right, even if that means it takes longer or costs more than the initial proposal. Eleanor nodded slowly, her mind already reworking the curriculum structure. I'll need access to subject matter experts in meteorology, ballistics, and optics. Also veteran instructors who understand the gap between competitive shooting and operational requirements. And we need to be realistic about candidate selection. Not every good shooter can become an extreme distance specialist. Agreed on all counts, Hartwick confirmed. He studied her for a moment. You know, Gunny, watching you today reminded me why I stayed in this career. It's easy to get caught up in bureaucracy and forget that at its core, the military is about people with extraordinary skills doing things most consider impossible. You reminded everyone on that range what excellence actually looks like. Eleanor met his gaze with quiet appreciation. I was fortunate to receive excellent training early in my career, and even more fortunate to have opportunities to develop those skills under real-world pressure. Not everyone gets those chances. This program could provide that foundation for a new generation. She paused, her expression turning serious. But we need to be honest with them about what it takes. The years of practice, the failed shots, the constant learning. Success at extreme distances isn't about talent alone. It's about dedication to a craft that demands everything you have. There was a knock at the door, and Brennan entered at Hartwick's invitation. The staff sergeant carried a folder and wore an expression of determined purpose. Sir Gunny Voss, I wanted to discuss something before the evening briefing. He set the folder on the desk. I've been reviewing my performance over the competition, analyzing where my calculations were wrong and my environmental reading failed. I've identified at least 15 distinct errors in my approach to the 2,700-meter attempts. Eleanor opened the folder, scanning his detailed analysis. His notes were thorough and brutally honest about his mistakes. This is excellent work, Staff Sergeant. Self-assessment this detailed is rare and valuable. Most shooters blame equipment or conditions rather than examining their own decision-making process. Brennan shifted his weight, his humility genuine. Gunny, I'd like to request assignment to the new training program, assuming it's approved. I know I was arrogant this week, and I clearly have huge gaps in my knowledge, but I'm willing to put in the work to fix that. What you demonstrated today is the level I want to reach, even if it takes years. Eleanor considered him thoughtfully. The program will require complete commitment, Staff Sergeant. Long hours on the range, in uncomfortable conditions, extensive classroom work on subjects that might seem unrelated to shooting, and constant confrontation with your limitations. She met his eyes directly. Are you prepared to start over essentially as a beginner, despite your current skill level? Yes, ma'am, Brennan replied without hesitation. Watching you today, show me how much I don't know. I'd rather spend years learning properly than waste time being confidently wrong. Hartwick interjected. Staff Sergeant Brennan isn't the only one requesting assignment. I've received formal requests from Gunnery Sergeant Reeves, Sergeant Kowalski, and 4 others who either competed or observed today. Word is spreading and interest is high. Eleanor smiled slightly. Good. Competition for slots will ensure we get committed students. She looked back to Brennan. If you're accepted into the program, Staff Sergeant, the first lesson is this. Forget everything you think you know about shooting. We'll rebuild your understanding from the ground up, incorporating what was correct but correcting what wasn't. That requires ego death, accepting that despite your accomplishments, you're still a beginner at this level. I understand, Gunny, Brennan said firmly. I'm ready for that. After Brennan departed, Eleanor and Hartwick continued working through the curriculum structure until late evening. They were interrupted by a call from General Morrison requesting Eleanor's presence at an informal gathering of senior officers. She arrived at the officers' club to find Morrison holding court with several colonels and lieutenant colonels, discussing the day's demonstration and its implications for training priorities. Morrison waved Eleanor over, making room for her at the table. "Gentlemen, Master Gunnery Sergeant Eleanor Voss, the woman who made 5 consecutive hits at 2,700 meters this afternoon. Gunny, I was just explaining to these skeptics that I watched those shots personally, and they were textbook perfect." One of the colonels, an infantry officer named Richardson, studied Eleanor with frank curiosity. "Gunny, I've been in the Corps 28 years, and I've never seen shooting like that. What's the secret? Is it equipment, technique, natural ability?" Eleanor settled into the offered chair, considering her response. "It's everything and nothing, sir. The equipment matters, but I've seen people with perfect rifles miss consistently. Technique is crucial, but technique alone won't overcome poor environmental reading. Natural ability helps, but I know talented shooters who never develop discipline and remain mediocre." She paused, organizing her thoughts. The real secret, if there is one, is accepting that becoming exceptional requires years of deliberate practice with constant self-assessment and willingness to fail repeatedly until you understand why you failed. Richardson nodded slowly. "That's not a message that sells well in an era of quick training cycles and rapid deployment requirements." "No, sir, it's not," Eleanor agreed. "But it's the truth. If the Marine Corps wants shooters who can perform reliably at extreme distances under operational pressure, there are no shortcuts. You're looking at minimum 2 years of intensive training after someone already qualifies as a competent marksman. That's the investment required to develop genuine expertise." Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious. "Then that's what we'll do. I'm authorizing a 3-year pilot program with funding for proper equipment, dedicated ranges, and full-time instructor staff." He looked at Eleanor directly. "With you as the program architect and lead instructor. We'll start small, maybe 15 students in the first class, and build from there based on results." The conversation continued for another hour, ranging across topics of program structure, candidate selection, evaluation metrics, and integration with existing sniper schools. Eleanor found herself enjoying the discussion, her mind fully engaged with the challenge of designing something comprehensive and effective. These senior officers were taking her expertise seriously, treating her insights as valuable rather than dismissing her because of age or appearance. As the evening wound down and officers began departing, Morrison remained with Eleanor at the table. "There's something else I wanted to discuss privately, Gunny." He pulled out a folder marked with classification stamps. "Your operational record is remarkable. Deployments I can't discuss in detail, but impacts I can confirm were significant. The work you did saved lives and influenced outcomes in ways that remain classified." Eleanor nodded slowly, memories flickering across her mind of distant places and difficult shots made under circumstances she could never fully discuss. "That work was a long time ago, General. Different world, different conflicts." "Perhaps," Morrison acknowledged. "But the skills that made you effective then are what we need to pass forward now. The world is changing, but the need for precision, for people who can make impossible shots in impossible conditions, that never goes away." He closed the folder. "What you're building here isn't just a training program. It's a legacy. The knowledge you carry, the hard-won expertise from decades of real-world application, that needs to live beyond you. These young Marines like Brennan and Reeves, they're hungry to learn. Give them what you know, Gunny. Build something that lasts." The final day of the original competition arrived with a formal ceremony that had taken on new significance after Eleanor's demonstration. What had begun as a standard inter-unit competition had transformed into something larger, a moment that would be remembered and discussed throughout the Marine Corps community for years to come. The base parade ground filled with Marines from across the installation, word having spread about the remarkable events of the previous days. The competitors stood at attention in formation, their dress uniforms immaculate, their bearing professional despite the underlying excitement about what was to unfold. Eleanor stood with Colonel Hartwick and the senior staff, wearing her own dress blues that she had retrieved from storage, the uniform still fitting despite the decades since she had last worn it. General Morrison took the podium to address the assembled Marines. Over the past 4 days, we have witnessed exceptional displays of marksmanship from our competitive shooters. Staff Sergeant Brennan, Gunnery Sergeant Reeves, and the other competitors demonstrated skill and dedication that reflects well on their training and commitment. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the formation. But we also witnessed something else. We witnessed a lesson in humility, in the danger of assumptions, and in the enduring nature of expertise. Morrison gestured toward Eleanor. Master Gunnery Sergeant Eleanor Voss, retired, came to this competition as a technical advisor. Most of you saw an elderly civilian woman taking notes and occasionally offering observations. What you didn't see was one of the most accomplished precision marksmen in Marine Corps history, a warrior whose operational record remains partially classified, but whose skills are now unquestionably demonstrated. He detailed Eleanor's demonstration at 2,700 meters, describing each shot for those who hadn't witnessed it personally. The assembled Marines listened with rapt attention, many stealing glances at Eleanor, who stood quietly, uncomfortable with the attention, but accepting it as necessary. Yesterday, Gunny Voss accomplished what our best current shooters could not, Morrison continued. 5 consecutive hits at extreme distance, under observation, with perfect precision. But more importantly, over the course of this week, she taught us something crucial about respect, about listening, and about recognizing that expertise doesn't always announce itself with obvious credentials. He looked directly at the competitors. How many of you dismissed her advice? How many of you failed to recognize what was standing right in front of you? Brennan stood straighter in formation, his jaw tight, clearly feeling the weight of Morrison's words. Around him, several other competitors shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own moments of casual dismissal toward the woman they now understood they should have been learning from all along. Morrison continued, "The Marine Corps is built on a foundation of warriors who came before us, who developed skills and knowledge through years of dedication, and often in circumstances we can barely imagine. We dishonor that foundation when we dismiss experience because it comes in unexpected packages, when we value appearance over capability, when we let assumptions blind us to wisdom standing right in front of us." He announced the official competition results, with Reeves narrowly edging out Brennan for first place, followed by Kowalski in third. Each received recognition and awards, their accomplishments genuine even in the shadow of Eleanor's demonstration. Then Morrison called Eleanor forward, requesting she join him at the podium. Master Gunnery Sergeant Voss served this nation with distinction for over 3 decades, Morrison said as Eleanor approached. Her contributions to special operations, to advanced marksmanship programs, and to the success of countless missions remain largely unknown because much of her work was and remains classified. But her legacy is about to become very public. He described the approved training program, the 3-year pilot with full funding and support, with Eleanor as the program architect and lead instructor. The assembled Marines erupted in applause, a thunderous response that spoke to their recognition of both Eleanor's demonstrated skill and the value of the program she would build. Eleanor accepted the microphone with visible reluctance, and used to public speaking after so many years away from military ceremonies. She looked out at the hundreds of faces, young Marines at the beginning of their careers, seeing in them echoes of the countless warriors she had worked with over her decades of service. "Thank you, General Morrison," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground despite her discomfort. "I didn't come to this competition expecting to shoot. I came to observe, to learn what current training methods were producing, and to see where I might be able to contribute." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "What I learned is that the Marine Corps is still producing exceptional warriors, skilled, dedicated, committed to excellence. But I also learned that we have work to do in teaching humility, in fostering respect for unexpected sources of knowledge, and in recognizing that the warrior standing next to you might know things you desperately need to learn. She spoke about the importance of continuous learning, about staying humble despite accomplishments, about the danger of letting confidence become arrogance. Her words were direct and unadorned, carrying the weight of experience earned through decades of demanding service. Staff Sergeant Brennan approached me several times this week with advice that I offered, she said. Initially, he dismissed that advice because I didn't look like someone whose opinion mattered. She looked directly at him in formation. By the end of the week, he was actively seeking that same advice because he had learned to value knowledge over appearance. That's growth. That's the kind of adaptation that makes good warriors into exceptional ones. She continued, her message expanding to encompass the entire assembled formation. Every person you meet knows something you don't. Every warrior who came before you earned wisdom through experiences you haven't faced. Your job is to recognize that wisdom, to seek it out, to learn from it even when it comes from unexpected sources. She gestured toward the competitors. These young Marines are skilled and dedicated. With proper training and continued humility, some of them will exceed anything I accomplished, but only if they remain hungry to learn, willing to be wrong, and open to instruction from anyone who has knowledge to share. The ceremony concluded with formal awards and recognition. Eleanor received a commendation from General Morrison, though they both understood that her most significant contribution was still ahead in the form of the training program she would build. As the formation dispersed, Marines approached Eleanor in a steady stream, thanking her for her service, requesting advice, asking about the new program. Brennan waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching. Gunny, I want to formally apologize not just for dismissing your advice, but for the attitude behind that dismissal. I was arrogant, overconfident, and blind to what I didn't know. Watching you shoot, learning your background, understanding how much expertise I was ignoring, that was humbling in the best possible way. Eleanor studied him with an expression of approval. That humility will serve you well, Staff Sergeant. You have talent and dedication. What you needed was perspective on how much further you can go and how much more there is to learn. She extended her hand. If you're accepted into the program, I'll work you harder than you've ever been worked. I'll tear down everything you think you know and rebuild it properly. Are you still interested? Brennan shook her hand firmly. More than ever, Gunny. I want to learn from the best, even if that means starting over from the beginning. Reeves approached next, her competitive nature evident even in this moment of recognition. Gunny, watching you shoot was like seeing the ceiling raise. I thought I was near the top of what was possible. Now I realize I'm still at the beginning of understanding this craft. She paused, her expression serious. I want it on that program. I want to learn what you know. Eleanor smiled. The program will need dedicated students who understand that expertise is built through years of deliberate practice. Both of you have the foundation. Now it's about building on that foundation properly, patiently, and with realistic expectations about how long true mastery takes. As the sun set over the base, Eleanor stood at the range where she had made her demonstration shots just one day earlier. The distant target was barely visible in the fading light, a small dark shape on the hillside that represented both a technical challenge she had met and a beginning of something new. Behind her lay decades of classified service, of shots made in circumstances she could never fully discuss, of skills developed through countless hours of practice and real-world application. Ahead lay the opportunity to pass that knowledge forward, to build a program that would train the next generation of precision marksmen, to ensure that the hard-won expertise she carried would live beyond her. It was a different kind of mission than those she had undertaken in her active duty years, but in its own way just as important. The young Marines like Brennan and Reeves deserved the best training possible, deserved to learn from someone who had actually done the work at the highest levels. Colonel Hartwick joined her at the range fence. Impressive sunset, he observed. Eleanor nodded. Good light for observation. Clear air, minimal mirage. Perfect conditions for teaching environmental reading. Hartwick smiled. Always the instructor. He was quiet for a moment. You know, Gunny, What you did this week will be talked about for years. The legend of the grandmother who outshot the Marines. It's already spreading beyond this base. Eleanor shrugged slightly. Legends are fine as long as they don't obscure the real lessons. The point wasn't that I can shoot. The point is that everyone dismissed me until I proved myself, and that dismissal cost them opportunities to learn. She turned to face him. That's what we need to fix with this program. Teaching technical skills is important, but teaching respect for knowledge regardless of its source, that might be even more crucial. 3 months after the competition, Eleanor stood in the newly constructed Advanced Marksmanship Training Facility, watching the first class of 15 students work through environmental reading exercises. Brennan and Reeves were among them, along with 13 other carefully selected Marines who had demonstrated both technical aptitude and the humility necessary for advanced training. The facility bore her fingerprints in every detail, from the extended range complex to the classroom equipped with atmospheric monitoring equipment to the custom-built shooting positions designed for extended observation periods. The transformation in her students was already visible. Brennan, who had arrived cocky and overconfident, now approached each training evolution with methodical caution, questioning his assumptions and seeking feedback constantly. Reeves had channeled her competitive nature into rigorous self-assessment, maintaining detailed training logs that documented every shot and every environmental condition. The others showed similar growth, their initial swagger replaced by genuine respect for the complexity of the craft they were learning. Eleanor moved among the students as they studied wind patterns, offering quiet corrections and insights. She had structured the program to emphasize observation over action, requiring students to spend hours simply watching conditions change before they were allowed to shoot. The approach frustrated some initially, but gradually they began understanding that accurate shooting at extreme distances required reading environments with the same precision they read their scopes. During a break, Corporal Barnes approached with his training log. "Gunny, I've been tracking my wind calls against actual impacts for 6 weeks now. I'm seeing patterns in how I consistently underestimate gusting conditions. Do you have recommendations for correcting that bias?" Eleanor reviewed his meticulous notes with approval. "Your self-assessment is excellent, Corporal. The gusting issue is common because our brains want to average conditions rather than account for peaks." She pulled out her own well-worn data book. "Try this. Instead of calculating for average wind speed, identify the gust pattern frequency and calculate for the peak that's most likely to occur during your bullet's flight time. Assume the worst case rather than the average case." Barnes nodded, making notes in his log. "That's counterintuitive, but it makes sense. Better to overcompensate slightly than undercompensate and miss completely." "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed. "At extreme distances, small errors become large misses. Conservative calculations that account for worst-case conditions will serve you better than optimistic averages." Colonel Hartwick visited regularly to observe training progress and discuss program development. On this particular afternoon, he arrived with General Morrison and several other senior officers who were evaluating the program for potential expansion. They observed from a tower as students conducted live-fire exercises at 1,800 meters, a distance the class had been building toward for weeks. Morrison watched through binoculars as Brennan made 3 consecutive hits on a moving target. His timing and lead calculations demonstrably improved from his competition performance months earlier. Impressive development, Gunny. 3 months ago, he couldn't read fog layers. Now he's engaging moving targets at 1,800 meters with consistent success. Eleanor stood beside him, her own binoculars tracking each student's performance. He's dedicated to learning, General, willing to accept correction, eager to improve, humble about his limitations. Those qualities matter more than natural talent. She pointed toward Reeves, who was coaching another student through a difficult wind call. Gunnery Sergeant Reeves has become an excellent peer instructor. She understands the material deeply enough to explain it to others, which is the real test of mastery. Morrison lowered his binoculars. "I'm authorizing expansion to 3 classes per year starting next fiscal year. The initial results here justify increased investment. He looked at Eleanor directly. You were right about the time requirements. This can't be rushed. But what you're producing is exactly what we need. Marines who don't just shoot well, but who understand the craft at a level that allows them to adapt to any conditions. The afternoon progressed with students working through increasingly complex scenarios. Eleanor had designed exercises that introduced unexpected variables, equipment malfunctions, and time pressure to simulate operational stress. She wanted graduates who could perform not just on perfect range days, but in the chaos and uncertainty of real-world missions. As the training day concluded, Eleanor gathered the class for an after-action review. She went through each student's performance, offering specific feedback that was simultaneously encouraging and demanding. Her approach balanced recognition of progress with clear identification of remaining deficiencies. The students listened with complete attention, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. Before dismissing them, she addressed the larger lessons of the day. You've all made remarkable progress over these 3 months. You're shooting farther and more accurately than you were when we started. But progress can breed overconfidence if you're not careful. She paused, ensuring she had their complete attention. The moment you think you've mastered this craft is the moment you stop learning. I've been shooting for 60 years, and I still discover new things about environmental reading, ballistics, and equipment optimization. Mastery is a journey without a destination. Brennan raised his hand. Gunny, when you made those demonstration shots at 2,700 meters, did you feel confident or uncertain? Eleanor considered the question carefully. Both. I was confident in my fundamentals and my environmental reading. Those skills are deeply ingrained after decades of practice. But I was also aware of how many variables could affect those shots, how much had to align perfectly for success. Confidence without respect for complexity is arrogance. What I felt was prepared uncertainty, if that makes sense. Ready to execute, but aware that even perfect preparation doesn't guarantee perfect results. The class absorbed this, several students making notes. Reeves added a follow-up question. How do you maintain that balance between confidence and humility, especially when you've achieved the level of skill you demonstrated? Eleanor smiled slightly. By remembering every shot I've missed, every environmental call I got wrong, every moment where conditions surprised me despite my experience. She gestured around the facility. This program exists because I remember my failures more clearly than my successes. Those failures taught me what I needed to learn. Your job is to fail intelligently, learn from those failures, and gradually reduce their frequency through better understanding. After dismissing the class, Eleanor remained at the range as evening settled over the base. The students departed in small groups. Their conversations focused on the day's lessons and tomorrow's challenges. She walked the firing line alone, checking equipment and making notes about facility improvements that might enhance training effectiveness. Brennan returned unexpectedly, approaching her position with visible purpose. Gunny, I wanted to thank you privately, not just for the training, though that's been transformative, but for the lesson in humility that started everything. He paused, choosing words carefully. I was arrogant when this competition started, dismissive of you, overconfident in my abilities, closed to learning from unexpected sources. You could have embarrassed me publicly when you demonstrated your skills. Instead, you turned it into a teaching moment for everyone. Eleanor set down her equipment checklist. Staff Sergeant, you weren't unique in your initial attitude. Most young warriors go through a phase where they think they know more than they do. The important thing is whether you grow beyond that phase. She met his eyes. You have. You become genuinely humble while maintaining confidence. That's the balance every shooter needs to find. I hope to reach your level someday, Brennan said. Maybe not for decades, but eventually. Eleanor smiled warmly. You'll reach it if you maintain your dedication and stay open to continuous learning. But remember, the level isn't really about hitting targets at extreme distances. It's about the wisdom to recognize what you don't know, the humility to seek knowledge wherever it exists, and the discipline to practice deliberately for years without shortcuts. Those qualities matter more than raw shooting ability. As Brennan departed and full darkness settled over the range, Eleanor stood alone under stars beginning to emerge in the California sky. Behind her lay a lifetime of service, of shots made and missions completed, of skills developed through countless hours of practice and real-world application. Ahead lay years of passing that knowledge forward, of shaping warriors who would carry the craft into the future with proper respect for its complexity and proper humility about their own limitations. If you connected with this story, drop a comment about what resonated most with you, or share if you've witnessed similar courage and hidden expertise in someone who initially seemed ordinary. Maybe you know a veteran whose capabilities surprised everyone, or you've learned important lessons about not judging people by their appearance. She thought about the young Marines in her program, about Brennan and Reeves, and the others who were hungry to learn and willing to put in the work. They would become excellent shooters if they maintained their dedication. More importantly, they would become the kind of warriors who respected knowledge regardless of its source, who remained humble despite accomplishments, who understood that true mastery required lifelong commitment to learning. The range was silent now, empty of shooters but full of potential. Eleanor locked the facility and walked toward her truck, her shadow long in the security lighting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons to teach, new opportunities to pass forward the hard-won expertise of her lifetime. The work was demanding, the standards uncompromising, but the mission was clear. Build something that lasts. Train warriors who would honor the craft and respect the knowledge of those who came before. Ensure that dismissing expertise because it came in unexpected packages would become increasingly rare in the Marines she helped shape. Her truck started with familiar reliability, and she drove slowly through the base toward her quarters. In the distance, the ranges stretched into darkness, waiting for tomorrow's students and tomorrow's lessons. The legend of the grandmother who outshot the Marines would fade eventually, becoming just another story told in mess halls and ready rooms. But the program she was building, the standard she was establishing, the warriors she was shaping, those would endure far beyond any legend. That was the legacy that mattered, the contribution that would outlast her and honor the countless others who had dedicated their lives to the craft of precision marksmanship in service to their nation.